This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Today's the day. It is our first official Friday Reformation podcast. I said I've had the Mid-South project in the works for a while, and now we're ready to finally jump aboard the bandwagon. And after one viewing, I can already tell this is going to be a solid investment. I won't be losing sleep at night over having subjected myself to all elite middle school, or whatever we're calling that drama factory. No, the only drama happening on Mid-South television is the kayfabe storylines that are happening on the TV screen. So that would probably be the perfect opportunity for me to slide right in with the intros. I haven't really done this in a while, so here we go. Welcome to the FSWR podcast. We are here on Monday and Friday every week. Going forward, we'll have a new format to both programs. I've also had some modifications in the works for the Monday show, which I detailed this previous week. It used to be a good night for a fight on Saturdays with Collision. That was when Punk was still around. And now that they've decided to immediately turn that show into Rampage Light, I've made the executive decision to basically can that review series altogether. Because why would I want to essentially watch 4 hours of Dynamite every week when I can opt out to watch 0? So today, for the Friday show, we've got the Crockett review, we've got the World Class review, as has been the mainstay with the Friday show for the last couple years. We will also be adding the middle segment for this week, the Mid-South Television Review Series, which I'm very much looking forward to talking about today. And then, of course, Saturday, we'll be adding the NXT Review Series to our list of classic content. More ways to keep the Monday show more WWF, WWE focused. We've already got the Retro Raws in the works. SmackDown is watchable, although not the most enjoyable show to watch every week, unless LA Knight is booked. But the NXT review series was something I figured, hey, it's WWE content, it's under the umbrella, it's enough of a middle ground area where it's technically classic content without being super retro. You know, we already have a lot of stuff we're talking about from the 80s, and God, that could last a lifetime if we really wanted to go down that rabbit hole. The NXT archives will be a fun way to give some modern fans a little taste of what they perceive to be the boom period of the 2010s. The black and gold brand era. Was it as great as it was chalked up to be? Probably not. And that's why I'll get to have fun and rain on everybody's parade. Because I like being a jerk. Of course, it's not the only reason. It's just about 80% of the reason. But with that said, got plenty to talk about in the meantime. And as we segue into the Crockett discussion for the week, this is where I wish I had the admonish button like Steven Crowder has for his podcasts. I did not clip the discussion last week, but if you watched the previous show, I had a very brief conversation about the Nikita Koloff TV title story, and it was somewhere during a Jim Cornette promo on the show, I think it was in the final segment, where he mentioned something about Beautiful Bobby and Sweet Stan challenging Nikita for the TV title. I believe I said the other week, I don't think that match ever happened. Well, sure enough, turns out I'm a lying sack of shit. Because it did happen. 1 week later. Boy, am I an idiot. The big featured match for the card this week. Nikita Koloff versus Bobby Eaton for the World's Television title. Talk about blowing the call. Now, granted, I had no memory of it happening here in 1987. Probably because it was just a random TV match with a fucked finish. But, I mean, with me being such a huge Midnight Express fan, you'd have thought I would have remembered something like that. That beautiful Bobby got a big featured attraction match this week. In singles action. You didn't see it too often. I also remember having a discussion about the dilemma of the brown suit. How it is a very off-putting color scheme for a suit, and I would highly encourage most men out there to avoid the brown suit look at all costs. Well, Tony Schiavone, he took the opposite of that advice here in 1987. Last week, I believe it was J.J. Dillon rocking the shit-stained suit. Now Tony's out there rocking the same look. And it did not look good on Tony either. The brown color. Although, to be fair, his suit was a lighter brown. So at worst, I could probably call it the mud look. Anyway, now they brought out Jim Crockett at the start of the program to do some housekeeping for Starrcade, the big fall event for Crockett Promotions. We are slowly edging toward that show now that I'm looking at the date here. And as we're piecing the card together for that program, he gave us a little bit of an insider scoop on what's going to be announced regarding the state of the UWF World's Television title, currently held by Terry Taylor. He was not very specific on details here, but, I mean, if you're smart enough, you could probably put 2 and 2 together, and what was essentially being set up for the Starrcade event. I did like how even the babyface announcer, Tony Schiavone, he could not help but take a shot at Tully Blanchard by noting, well, Nikita Koloff has already proven to be a much more defending champion than Tully ever was. I was just like, what a fucking asshat. He just couldn't help but take a subtle dig at Tully. Loved it, though. So from there we go back to the ring for, well, the graphic said New Breed versus Alan Martin. It was not a handicap match. It was only Sean Royal present here. Chris Champion was still out of action. I'm not entirely sure if that was a typo or maybe it was part of the New Breed gimmick that went completely over my head. Maybe we were supposed to predict the future and realize that Chris Champion was actually secretly working as Sean's partner behind Teddy Long's back. Because, you know, they were time travelers. Regardless, they had a match. At one point, Tony Schiavone mentioned on commentary, "Do you notice something about Sean Royal's hair?" To which I immediately responded with, "Yes. It looks normal. He now has a regular crew cut. Now he just looks like an ordinary underneath job guy with a decent haircut and bad ring gear. As opposed to the total outlaw look." Sean kind of did all his regular stuff. He won with the diving knee drop. I was more so wondering, why the hell were they giving Alan Martin so much offense? Of all the job guys they were using at the time, they were actually letting Alan Martin get a bit of shine. Very strange. Don't know if that ever led to anything. I mean, frankly, all it did was draw out what was already a telegraph finish anyway. But yeah, they're still running with this temporary Sean Royal singles push. I know it never really goes beyond a certain point, because by the end of the year, I'm pretty sure he's out of the business. But every single time I watch him wrestle, man, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to sit here and say that he was totally rotten, because he could obviously do some stuff. Like, he was competent in the ring. The only thing I always think when I watch him is, really? This guy? They were going to try and give this dude a singles push? I don't get it. I mean, if you sat down with me and provided me with the entire NWA roster in 87, I could rattle off like 50 other guys that I would consider pushing before Sean Royal ever crossed my mind. I mean, take away the wacky ring tights. He's so plain looking. Like I said earlier, the whole look just screams generic enhancement guy. But let's move on with the showcase match for the program. Jim Cornette making sure to provide us with the ring intros for the occasion. And man, it was such a serious moment for the Midnights this week. Cornette decided to wear a normal suit. No flashy colors. No mismatched ties. He was going with the charcoal blazer, black slacks, red tie. So you know he must have been serious. The match is Nikita Koloff defending the World's Television title against Bobby Eaton. And you know, this is just one of those segments where I said to myself, fuck the notes. Just sit back and watch it. Enjoy it for what it is. You know it's going to be good. You don't need to write down spots. Just be a fan for like 5 seconds. And I actually don't think this would be the only time Bobby and Nikita would end up working together. I mean, I think they wrestled a few years later on one of the Saturday Night Main Event specials. You know, they did some tag stuff together later on, but in terms of like strict one-on-one singles matches, they had a couple, but I certainly didn't remember this one. And like, I mean, obviously I don't need to sit here and remind you all how great Bobby Eaton was. Everything he did was just so fluid. And you just watch him in there with Nikita. It's like they had done this match a million times. Nikita's totally at home. Bobby's calling the shots and guiding him along the way. Like, they're always in the right spot for everything they do. The thing Beautiful Bobby was particularly great at is always knowing when to slow things down, how to build up to the big sequences. Like, yeah, Bobby could do a lot of the flashy stuff. He was one of the few guys on the studio shows that was actually comfortable going up top to do all the big rope dive spots. But they were done with a purpose. If Bobby was going to do a big move, he was going to make it count. And if he wasn't going up for something big, he was working over a body part. Or he was getting the heat on Nikita with mat holds and trying to get everybody to rally behind Nikita. You know, modern fans would misinterpret that for calling it a rest hold. I mean, maybe in a sense you could argue it was the case if you classify it as Bobby calling spots to try and set Nikita up for the big comeback. But I'm always turned off by the term rest hold because there's so much negative connotation that comes with it. Just everything about this match, it was so basic, but it was so logical. You know, it shows that you don't have to do a million bumps and flips to make a match work. If you got the right babyface and the right heel, you can actually do pro wrestling correctly and get it over. You know, because of the length the match went, I wasn't entirely convinced they weren't going to go to a time limit draw. Bobby's in there working over Nikita for such a long stretch. By the time Nikita actually started making the comeback, I was like, you know, we're probably closing in on the 15 to 20 minute mark. So when they actually did the DQ finish at the end, I was kind of surprised. Basically what happens is Nikita makes the comeback. He catches Bobby with a shoulder block off the ropes. And as he goes for the pin, Cornette hits the ring for a distraction spot so Stan could run in the back door and clock Nikita in the back of the head with a racket. And at first I winced because God, I just watched Stan give Nikita a blind headshot with a gimmicked weapon. I mean, worked or not, the fact that Nikita never saw the shot coming, I was like, God damn. Like, were they trying to kill Nikita Koloff here? And of course, while Bobby tries to go up top to hit a big diving knee drop, here comes Dusty to hit the ring, and he throws Bobby off the top. And with pandemonium ensuing further, Dusty locks in the Weaver hold on Bobby while Stan is trying to hit the ring to pull him out. But meanwhile, there's Nikita fending him off with a tennis racket, so that basically left Bobby at Dusty's mercy. We get the hilarious visual at the end where all the underneath guys come out to carry Bobby's dead carcass to the back by his hands and knees. Cornette's flipping out at Teddy Long, and well, I don't think we ever got a clear-cut indication of what the finish was here. Presumably, it's Bobby Eaton over via DQ. But the only thing we got from Tony on commentary was, well, there you have it. I was like, sure did, Tony. Would have been nice if we actually bothered to get a clear indication on what the finish was, instead of leaving it up to interpretation. I mean, DQ finish aside, these are the kinds of television matches you look forward to on the syndicated shows. You know, the squashes serve their purpose, but man, when you get these kinds of high-caliber feature matches with the top stars, factoring in all the angles and the big moments that follow, I'm telling you, man, it's why this period of the business is so memorialized. It's for that and great moments like what we got with Dusty and Nikita after the break. You know, Dusty's promo was more or less forgettable here, but boy was Nikita on fire. You know, first he talked about how the Midnights have apparently forgotten their history. The fact that the Superpowers beat the Midnights in the finals of the '87 Crockett Cup, which was something I really didn't even think about until he brought it up. It was great attention to detail. My personal favorite part of this promo, Nikita goes, "You asked me, Tony, what I think of getting and hitting back of head with racket. I use American term. It's a bunch of bullshit." Now, of course, they had to bleep out bullshit, but I laughed so hard hearing Nikita do the fake Russian accent while saying the word bullshit. We've now reached the point in Nikita's wrestling career where his American pride has run so thick, he has now adopted the inappropriate slang terminology. I mean, it's rare that anybody swears on this program, unless your name's Dusty. So the fact that Nikita got the green light to come out here and say bullshit on live television, it shows you how much they thought of him. And while they still had the fans wired up here, you got Nikita snarling at the booth. Dusty's firing up now. So why not bring Magnum TA out for a special cameo? I mean, if the fans didn't already pop wood previously, you could tell they were at the sight of seeing Magnum. It was totally random. I had no idea where he came from. He just kind of walked into the frame. But now he was more or less there to endorse Nikita and Dusty. Still on the walking cane. And is doing a lot better physically, but man, he was still far from 100%. Even by this point in 1987. Coming up on about a year since the injury. Now, Tony did bring up the fact that he had been down working in the UWF recently as a commentator, so, you know, he was getting more heavily involved in the business again, but as far as getting back into the ring shape, it's so unfortunate. It really is. But the UWF plug was a way for them to kind of pitch to the video footage next. They showed a Terry Taylor-Shane Douglas match for the UWF TV title. This was filmed prior to Terry actually winning the belt, so they covered how the title switch happened. Eddie Gilbert winds up driving a chair into Shane's leg. So as Terry works that over for a few minutes, he ends up going over with a pinfall after having Shane locked in the figure four. It was more of a pass-out, knockout type of pinning predicament. I did jot down here during the video feed. It's funny how we've gone from Terry Taylor randomly feuding with Chris Adams on Crockett TV. Now all of a sudden, Terry is the UWF television champion. Now all of a sudden, Terry is about to enter a title versus title program in the lead up to Starrcade 87 against Nikita. Yeah, they just totally buffed right over that Chris Adams program, didn't they? And then we immediately go back to Crockett footage. And they replayed the angle from last week with Ron Garvin and the Horsemen during the syndicated TV match with Garvin and Anderson. This was the snippet with the classic visual of Lex Luger hoisting Dusty up into the torture rack, where the entire earth rotated on its axis the moment Dusty's feet left the ground. Gravity itself shifted completely upside down. I didn't even note the hilarity of seeing Tully actually help Luger get Dusty up in the air. I totally missed that. That was a thing. But following that, we got to see Flair's promo where he's just basking in the moment, talking about how the next time Dusty and Ronnie try to consider themselves legends, they can replay that tape back and watch as the Horsemen stomp them into oblivion. And Flair reminds everybody why his four best friends are the most elite athletes in the sport today. Yes, for the record, Ric Flair referred to J.J. Dillon as a quote-unquote athlete in 1987. Laughable. And then coming back from break, we circle back to our UWF plug. As I wrote down here, more heels gloating. We now go to the heel locker room, where Eddie Gilbert and Terry Taylor are gloating about taking the world's television title away from Shane Douglas. In this instance, it is Eddie interviewing Terry, and they're just sort of running down the laundry list of baby faces that Terry is looking to humiliate in future TV title defenses. But the big name on that list, the one they're looking at for the ultimate showdown, Nikita Koloff. Terry is here to prove that he's the only world's television champion. And once Terry gets done going through guys like Shane Douglas and Sting and Chris Adams, whoever has the courage to sign on the dotted line, the last stop is Nikita Koloff. And while they did not directly say title unification, it's basically what they were building towards. I have very little memory of the Terry Taylor-Nikita Koloff match from Starrcade 87. I mean, I've seen the VHS tape before. I vaguely remember some kind of story involving title-for-title stipulations. Not so much the actual match. I mean, I have much fonder memories of the Dusty Luger match. But hey, again, Crockett bought the UWF. I mean, he was aiming to get those guys in featured capacities as much as he could on the TV show. It took a while for them to actually be methodical with how everybody was brought in. But now there's a name and now there's a focus. Making sure instead of cramming in 1,500 guys on a given show, now they're prioritizing some of the bigger names they're bringing in, which is good. It's easier to follow when they don't bring over the entire fucking roster and then try to shoehorn them all into 2 hours. So from there, we go back to the studio for Tully Blanchard versus Mike Force. And here's everything I wrote down. Tully hit 1,000 moves in a row. Just stomped and pounded this guy into oblivion. Slingshot suplex. 1, 2, 3. And you won't believe this, the crowd was very behind Tully this week. Mind-blowing revelation. And in fact, they were pretty much behind the Horsemen, period. Because we get JJ, Tully, and Arn at the booth. And JJ's going on about all the bullshit involving the TV title match from earlier. He was basically cutting the promo for Jim Cornette, if we're being blunt. Out there running down the fact that Dusty, yet again, used that illegal chokehold on beautiful Bobby. Talking about how he's been trying to meet with Jim Crockett all day to discuss legal matter regarding the usage of that hold. But every time he goes to talk to the boss, strategically he is behind closed doors in meetings. Sounds like Tony Khan trying to avoid having to converse with employees that he wants to future endeavor but doesn't have the balls to do it. Anyway, no, Tully chimed in with a few words. Didn't really have much to add. But I did like, while Arn is doing his promo, he's running down the Rock and Roll Express and talking about how when there's a boulder in your way, you chip at it one step at a time. You know, it's what the Horsemen were built on. Overcoming obstacles one step at a time. Meanwhile, Tully is in the backdrop talking with JJ. It's right in the middle of Arn's promo. And I think we were led to believe that he was talking about something pertaining to business matter. But I could totally envision Tully being like, so JJ, where do you think we meet for dinner tonight? Just a casual BS conversation while Arn's in the middle of hard selling the feud with the Rock and Roll. I did like, too, while they were replaying footage of a recent NWA Pro taping, they're shooting the angle where Tully and Arn are beating up Kendall Windham. Of course, Ricky and Robert run down to make the save. And while Ricky rips off the waist belt and tries to whip Tully with it, of course, Arn's first comments are, quote, "That doesn't look like a wrestling hold to me." Because, of course, as we know, following our Four Horsemen history, they are men of pride, honor, and dignity. They would never stoop to such lows as to try to use foreign objects to win their matches. I love Arn. And they did a brief plug for the Western States Heritage title match with Barry for later on, where I believe his statement was, "I don't know why we're giving this match away for free on TV, but it'll be a pleasure to send a message to Barry and the rest of the locker room on who the most dominant group in wrestling is." Just had to make sure they threw that line in there. "We're giving you a pay-per-view caliber match for free on television, so you peons better like and appreciate it." And, well, before I actually go to that match, we had David Crockett pitched to ringside, standing by Missy Hyatt, who was more or less there to look pretty and basically talk about how great the entire heel roster was. I believe her exact quote was, "I think Barry's kind of cute, but he's no match for Arn Anderson." Some riveting journalism, if I do say so myself. She was very lucky she was hot. But, well, by this point, Missy was a couple years fresh into the business. She had already been doing the UWF stuff with Eddie Gilbert and the Hot Stuff International. She would become a more prominent figurehead in WCW by 88 or 89 onward, when she was more heavily active on the roster as a talent. She went through phases as a commentator, which I don't think really panned out like they expected. I mean, her WWF run was a total bust from what I remember. I think it was more or less a struggle bus period with her where, you know, they wanted to initially use her in a featured capacity because, I mean, look at her. She was a great looking female, but not really a great talker. She wrestled, but she was mid at best. So the valet thing was probably the easiest route for them to go with. The stuff with her and Paulie, well, hopefully we stick around doing these recaps long enough on the channel to get there, because boy, was it a fascinating time frame. a lot of her run during that 91 and 93 period of WCW was fascinating. But why don't we move on to Arn Anderson versus Barry Windham. I believe one of the first televised matches featuring the Western States Heritage Championship belt, which is more than I can say for the Alabama Junior Heavyweight title, which is basically a belt that exists in name only. But again, ma'am, removing my note-taking from the equation, just trying to watch this match as a casual viewer, it's really good stuff. It's a very different match in comparison to what we saw earlier with Nikita and Bobby. But at the same time, it's two top names having a back-and-forth competitive match. As David noted here at one point, they're hot and sweaty. Sure. Hypothetically speaking. Of course, Arn's an effective heel here, working the crowd. A lot of creative things he would do when he would try to cheat behind the ref's back. I like the tight pole spot while he had Barry hooked in a modified armbar from a kneeling position. He basically reached underneath his legs to yank on Barry's tights, which is quite impressive visually. It required a lot of flexibility on Arn's part, but it was funny because, like, the amount of effort it required to take to do this hold, but he still had to cheat because it's Arn. You know, it goes through ebbs and flows. Barry manages to get a flurry of offense going, but Arn would cut him off and go back to working him over. God, you watch Barry's facials here. He was so great at selling, dude. Like, you watch him during the heat portion of the match. His eyes are bugged out. He's selling the exhaustion. Looks like he's totally fighting on instinct. They do a great sequence where Barry tries to charge Arn toward the ropes, but Arn ducks. Barry takes a great bump over the top rope out to the concrete. Now, it was a commercial break spot, which was perfect. So they come back. Barry starts to make the comeback. He doesn't have a lot of gas left in the tank, but he's working his ass off. Catches Arn going after the leg, sets him up for the figure four. David and Tony are constantly bringing up the time limit here, that we're slowly approaching the 30-minute time limit mark. Totally telegraphing the finish ahead of time, but, you know, what can you do? And, now Barry's working over Arn's leg. At that point, they come back from their final break. Arn tries to powder and call it a night, but Barry ain't having any of that bullshit. So he stops Arn in the aisleway and carries him back to the ring to finish the job. And he catches Arn in the sleeper hold, which David can't help but ask, I wonder if Dusty and Johnny taught him how to use the Weaver lock. Because they got to mention Dusty at any point they can to remind everybody who the real top guys are. And, well, they do the double bonk spot. The countdown is slowly approaching the 1 minute mark. Arn tries to pull a Ric Flair to go up top for a big move, but Barry catches him for the superplex. They do the near fall immediately afterwards, where Arn gets the foot on the bottom rope. And right as Barry catches Arn with a lariat, the time expires. And of course, Arn is fucking pissed, as you can imagine. So he decides to take matter into his own hands. He gives Barry the gourd buster and counts his own visual pinfall, just for extra reinforcement, to prove next time on television that he got the pinfall, that we saw it clear as day. But like I said, great match. You know, even though this one happened on a Sunday syndicated show, it was totally different from the Nikita Bobby one, but it was hard-hitting. Both guys worked their asses off. I mean, if you can get over the fact that it was for a completely meaningless regional belt that nobody gave a shit about, it's Barry Windham versus Arn Anderson. I mean, with the vision of foresight, you know these guys end up being part of the same group in '88. It's one of those things where you kind of see it as a proving ground match for Barry. Yeah, he's still a babyface by this point, but by all accounts, it was a relatively clean match through and through. No horseman run-ins, no outside interference, none of that. It was just Arn and Barry going to a 30-minute Broadway. But you know how we always talk about the subtle things in wrestling that matter the most? I'm telling you, man, I get more out of watching Barry and Arn work each other over in holds than I do watching aggressive parkour. At least there's a story being told with what Barry and Arn are doing. It looks like two guys attempting to have some sort of athletic contest, not choreographed tumbling routines. You know, I talk about it all the time, but this, I think, is where the biggest disconnect comes in with modern versus old school wrestling fans. It's just one of those things where, because of the way younger fans have been educated, I don't think they'll ever have an appreciation for this kind of stuff anymore. You know, they might see it. They might acknowledge how hard both guys were working. But do they understand the psychology that goes into it? That, I think, is where the problem lies a lot of the time. You know, it's also where the issue comes in with star ratings, because, I mean, God, that scale is so broken to begin with. You know, because of its totally subjective nature, I can view this as a 4.5, 4 3/4 star match. Modern fans might only see it as a 3 1/4 or 3.5 star match. You know, it's always based on preference, but because there weren't 1,500 kickouts or near falls, how do younger fans learn to appreciate how this contrasts with everything we see today? Long matches. By that same token, the conversation can go the other way around. How if I sat down and watched a match where guys do a million flips and dives and kick out of everything in the book, I may rate it as a 2-star match and not think anything of it because I hate that style of wrestling and think it's bullshit. The whole video game mentality of guys hitting every move they can think of, kicking out in one, then immediately going back to doing more shit. You know, for what it's worth, there's a psychology that only makes sense to fans that care about moves and false finishes. Yeah, but for me, I'm the polar opposite. I can watch an Arn Anderson-Barry Windham match and not think anything of the moves or the kickouts because I get swept up into the backstory of Arn working over Barry's back, or Barry fighting from underneath and targeting Arn's leg. You know, it's one of the saddest things to me about coming on here and trying to critically talk about modern wrestling anymore. It's just there's too much of an influence on the video game style that's being implemented on mainstream television anymore. So when we do actually see something like FTR versus Juice and Jay, or CM Punk versus Samoa Joe, or whatever the match is, Cody and Seth in the Hell in a Cell, Gunther and Sheamus for the IC title last year, those are just recent matches that are coming to mind, but that kind of stuff is such a rarity anymore. It actually stands out. Where matches aren't based around moves, but it's based on the psychology and the facials and the selling and the storytelling. The fundamental things. The kinds of things that get lost in the shuffle today because, well, it's the way young guys are trained, the way they're educated, and the way they're brought up in the business. I should write a book. If only I had time. Guess I kind of went on a tangent there, didn't I? Well, we're not done, because we had a couple more things to talk about. With about 10 minutes left of programming, I could probably spend another 10 minutes talking about this one VTR alone, but since he is a name that we'll be hearing a lot more about in the next several months, I'll just keep the conversation basic here. I'm going to try to do my best Tony Schiavone impersonation, but we got our first on-screen sighting of Sting! On Crockett TV, that is. Now, Sting had obviously been in the Mid-South region for a period. UWF, sorry, not Mid-South. Brand change. It's going to take me a while to get used to. But he had been around the block for a while. A young, up-and-coming Stinger. In just about every sense of the word. Rocking the classic Sting look. The bleached blonde hair. The Warrior-inspired face paint. Super high energy. Super over with the crowd. Even for how new he was to the business by this point. And they showed like a 60-second squash. I don't even remember who he was wrestling, but holy cow. First thing that jumped out to me, green. I had completely forgotten how raw Sting was when he first started. Boy, was he far from a fluid worker yet. But there was something there. He had the look. He definitely hadn't bulked up to the same level he would a few years later. But he was definitely one of those guys where you look at and say, yup, he was going to be a big deal. It was kind of cool. And I think it's what? Is it next month? He actually debuts on the Superstation? I know he wrestles a squash pretty soon. I mean, we'll be reviewing plenty more Sting matches. It'll be a rough patch for the first several months, but by 88, once we get to the first Clash of Champions, talk about that star-making performance between him and Flair. The one that put Sting on the map. It's really crazy to think about, but we're not too far off from that. March of 88. The very first one. And Sting was in the main event. Here he was in September of the previous year. He barely knew how to throw a dropkick. This business is quite incredible at times. Speaking of things that seemed incredible at the time, guess who was in the TV main event this week? In a singles match. Figures because his partner worked with Nikita earlier on. Guess it was only fitting that Sweet Stan was going to get a showcase match this week. And he actually got to wrestle Mike Jackson. That was probably a Stan call. He ain't working with the Outlaw Jabronis, brother. They probably wanted to book him to work with Art Pritz. Stan said, nah, doesn't work for me, brother. I want the high-quality opponents. Now, of course, this is nowhere near the level of Bobby and Nikita. That's no disrespect to Stan. But it was a good reminder for anybody that forgot. Yeah, Stan Lane, very good professional wrestler. You know, even though he was primarily brought in to replace Condrey in the Midnights, Stan Lane was not a novice when it came to working singles matches. And they had a fun back-and-forth match here. Stan controlled a good chunk of it, but they let Jackson make a comeback. Stan cut him off in one with, well, I wrote this down. I'm not making it up. A double underhook suplex. A move that would barely be considered a transition move by today's standards. That was how Stan won. Alabama Junior Heavyweight Champion. Defeated via underhook suplex. I also believe this is the first time we ever heard somebody refer to Teddy Long as, quote, Peanut Head. Which unfortunately became a recurring theme for Teddy's insults over the years. Especially about a decade later when he ballooned up considerably. I mean, you don't believe me? Go back and look at pictures of Teddy Long when he was a manager on Nitro in the late 90s. It was rough. He never ages. Facially, he's always looked exactly the same. Whether it was in 1987 or 1997. But yeah, he went through some stages of heavy weight gain and heavy weight loss. But the Peanut Head jokes were sort of a staple. And then we rounded things out with Cornette doing a ranting promo. Talked about the superpowers. He recapped the match earlier with Nikita and Bobby, pointing out how much of a coward Dusty was for sticking his nose in business that did not pertain to him. And he's also on the JJ bandwagon of claiming that Dusty's Weaver lock is an illegal choke. And these heel managers had quite the conspiracy theories, didn't they? Anyway, he just kind of laid out the challenge to the superpowers for the tag titles. U.S. tag titles. I need to specify that. And, Stan stood there and made an X sign with his fingers, which I really didn't understand. But the women seemed to like it. Now, who am I kidding? They liked everything Stan did. He could have farted in the girls' general direction. They would have huffed it in and cried tears of joy. Pays to be good looking, I guess. All in all, very fun show to watch. 2 great main event quality matches, even though one was pre-taped. I love the evolution of the Horsemen right now. The building of Tully and Arn as a tag team, great. Nikita was fantastic on this program. And again, they're throwing in a lot of UWF footage, but it's not taking up the entire 2 hours like it was in the last month or so. Now that they put the focus on 1 or 2 key storylines, everything's a lot more concentrated now. Again, much like last week, it had the feel of a normal, top-shelf TBS episode of Crockett. They're still riding that hot streak. You could kind of see the cracks seeping through a little bit here by now, but they still had star power. The energy's there. The fans are into the shows. The storylines are great. Quite frankly, that's all they needed at the time. All right. Been really looking forward to getting the chance to do this little review series. I've had this one in my back pocket for a while. And I was honestly just waiting for the opportune time to pull the trigger on it. Now, if you want to hear my thoughts on my whole backstory with Mid-South Wrestling, you can go watch last week's show where I sort of broke down the logistics and gave you the lead up to how I settled on the Mid-South as the next review series. The short and sweet of it is, my brothers lived in Louisiana when they were young. Can't remember the exact channel it was hosted on television back then, but, they had the station. So whenever they got the chance, whatever scraps they could get their hands on, they ended up piecing together a solid little collection of VHS tapes. And I remember when I was really young, they'd come over to the house, whether dad would bring them over or if their mom would drop them off. Sometimes my middle brother would bring a thick-ass stack of tapes with him. And we'd hang out over the weekends. We'd watch some of the old footage. And it was kind of sporadic. Whatever he brought over, that's kind of what we settled on. I think I mentioned they had a heavy collection of tapes from like 83 and 84. The Extremities, not so much. They had a few stragglers from 82, 85 and 86, a handful of shows here and there. They weren't really like religious, consistent viewers or anything like that. They were all sort of on and off watchers of the product. They didn't really dive into the rabbit hole like I did when I was young. Like with me, I could literally go out of my way to get my hands on anything I could with what limited access I actually had to record stuff when I was younger. So, when it comes to the tape library for Mid-South, one thing you'll commonly hear me refer back to, from the window of like January of 83 until about the fall or winter of 84, that's sort of my area of expertise. I'll have a little more idea or better idea of what the timeline is. There will be certain moments or matches or angles and promos that don't really stand out above other ones, but there will be periods too where I'm like, I remember that clear as day, or I remember that debut, or I remember that moment. and then other times I'll be completely out to lunch. I've gone back over the last several years to kind of watch some sporadic shows here and there on the old network. I was mostly trying to immediately go for the glory period. And as we get into some of the stuff from '82, it'll sort of be a blind run for a little while. There will be small details that I pick up on, but for a lot of the story content, I'll need to get a refresher on. Might require some outside research, but hey, that's why we're here to do it. So here we are, baby. Mid-South Wrestling from September 11th, 1982. And man, even just going back and watching that old opening montage again, boy, does that bring back some memories right off the bat. It's so... I don't even know. Spacey. Like retro acid rock. It's totally an 80s thing. It's not like the world-class intro at all. But it's certainly memorable. And of course, right out of the gate, my main man, Boyd Pierce. One of my all-time favorite commentators from the territory days. What an oddball personality that cat was, but man, was he so cool. And the running joke with Boyd was, what kind of crazy off-the-wall suit scheme is he going to be wearing this time? And this one was moderately tame in comparison to some of the ones we would see him wear in the next year or so. He gave Jim Cornette a run for his money with his choice in tacky-looking suit choices. But it was part of the gimmick. He always wore wacky colors and goofy patterns. And joining him at the booth this week was Bob Roop, a name that might not sound familiar for any of the youths out there. He was a little before my time growing up as well. I think by the time I started watching wrestling, which for me would have been sometime in like '89, those are like my first memories of watching wrestling as a kid. I think Roop was already retired by then. I mean, his biggest claim to fame was working and training with Eddie Graham in Florida. That was toward the start of his career. Another one of those names that bounced around from place to place. In addition to the Mid-South run, I think he actually worked for the Pothos for a period of time too, if I'm not mistaken. Again, you know, he bounced back and forth between face and heel, but I would say he gained a lot more notoriety for the heel runs. Anything I've ever seen of Bob Roop, he was most definitely a heel on television. But he was a special guest color guy for this week. Kind of a non-entity on the headset, but yeah, he wasn't bad. He didn't get in the way. But for their big story angle from the previous week, it was centered around some controversy involving Mr. Wrestling 2. And let me just cover this right out of the gate. This is the kind of shit that is missing in today's business. Long, thorough recaps of previous wrestling angles, where everything is broken down step by step. Things are tied together from week to show how you get from point A to point B to point C, etc. You don't get recaps like this in wrestling anymore, and it's a shame. You know, in the case of AEW, you're lucky to get the announcers even mentioning something in passing. Most of the time, we or the audience are expected to know what the hell's going on. No, with Mid-South Wrestling, they were always cluing you in with things, making sure that you were kept up to speed with what was going on and why everything mattered. God forbid you're somebody like me. Maybe you're tuning in for the first time and you're like, well, I don't know what the hell's been going on with the key storylines. Well, they explained it in detail. 1 week ago, there was a Mid-South tag title match between Ted DiBiase and Hacksaw Duggan versus Mr. Olympia and the Junkyard Dog. I don't think DiBiase and Duggan were quite yet recognized as the Rat Pack. I think once Matt Bourne got added to the group, that's when they became the Rat Pack as a trio. But Mr. Wrestling 2 was assigned to be the special guest referee for that title match. So during the final moments, there was a ref bump to Mr. Wrestling 2. And while he was out on the floor selling, a decoy imposter Mr. Wrestling 2 hit the ring. And he counted a visual pinfall with the heels cheating to win the belts. And Bill Watts explained the fallout, which I'll get to momentarily. But before they actually showed the footage, Watts conducted an interview with the fake Wrestling 2, which is hilarious on its face because Mr. Wrestling 2, for those of you that didn't already know, he was not a mute. He cut promos. Somehow, Bill Watts was not able to decipher the difference in vocal intonation between the real Mr. Wrestling 2 and the fake one. So he's out there conducting the interview with the fake Wrestling 2. It never occurs to him at any point. You know, something sounds funky with this guy's voice. Must be indigestion. So naturally, out comes the real Wrestling 2 in a wife beater to beat the crap out of the fake Wrestling 2. Sends him powdering. And that's where Wrestling 2 gets on the mic and explains the whole story. He says that he was getting telegrams from fans asking about his recent matches in New Orleans. And Wrestling 2 claims that he knew nothing about it because he had been wrestling in the Omni recently, but he hadn't been flying from Atlanta to New Orleans to work multiple shows. So because something smelled fishy, he got on a flight to come down to New Orleans to see if his suspicions were correct. Sure enough, the fake Wrestling 2 was working in New Orleans under the same moniker. And of course, this all makes sense because the gimmick with Mr. Wrestling 2 is that he never revealed his identity. So, I mean, unless you already knew what his body looked like, how would you know? That's a clever little story angle. And so Bill Watts goes into detail about what President Charlie Lay decided to do about the title situation, since it's obvious that now there is a cosplay Wrestling 2 running around. He is overturning the decision from the previous week. The Mid-South tag titles are to be returned to Mr. Olympia and JYD. And this is real subtle what he said here, but I like that they brought this up. Under normal circumstances, had the match been a no DQ stipulation, well, his hands would have been tied because the anything goes deal would have factored into the decision. But since we saw both Wrestling 2s on camera at the exact same time, it would be stupid to insult the people's intelligence. We all clearly saw the real and the fake Wrestling 2 in the same camera frame. So he is moving forward with the decision to void the original call. And again, it's the subtle things with Mid-South that always mattered. Attention to detail. They were so careful with fine-tuning any potential plot holes. They covered their tracks. They made sure that everything was explained. And it all ended up tying together by the end. It was a very easy story to follow. And I knew nothing about it prior to seeing the footage. I had no memories of an imposter Wrestling 2 storyline in Mid-South. But holy cow. Imagine that. 11 minutes of a video recap made more sense than 3+ months of the Undertaker storyline in the WWF. Plus, this was more enjoyable to watch. So we're off to a great start. Third of the show already done and over with by the time they finished airing that video package. At which point we go back to the ring for our first TV match. It is Captain Redneck Dick Murdoch versus Billy Starr. No relation. Have not gotten the chance to recap a Dick Murdoch match in a hot minute. Christ, I'm trying to remember. What was the last thing he did on Crockett TV before he left? He was a Russian sympathizer, I remember that. He was hanging around Ivan Koloff and Vladimir Petrov for a cup of coffee. He was doing those scathing heel promos on Dusty Rhodes. And then one day, he just kind of vanished. And we never saw from him again. didn't he like, yeah, I think I remember. Didn't he give Nikita Koloff a brainbuster on the floor? And they wrote him out in storyline? That must have been the official send-off because that happened months ago. And his name has not been brought up since. Well, here he is. 5 years prior on Mid-South doing babyface squashes with underneath job guys. And he won this in pretty rapid succession with a brainbuster. Not much to add. And one thing Mid-South put a heavier focus on is giving the top guys ring intros more frequently. And Murdoch came out with the Marines hymn, which is very fitting. Only other thing I noted about this was Bob Roop joking about Billy Starr being a former junior heavyweight title contender in another part of the country. Meanwhile, you take one look at Billy Starr, and at best, I would say he looked like a fat homeless man with a wet sandbag body. Nothing about him screamed junior heavyweight. Now, of course, these were different standards back then. These days, Billy Starr would have probably been considered a super heavyweight. So then we came back for Mr. Olympia versus Ron Cheatham. Another simple little babyface squash for Olympia. One thing I always loved about Mid-South, and I still get a kick out of this to this day. So Reeser Bowden was the ring announcer during this period, and they did traditional ring intros for the wrestlers, including the job guys. In the case of Ron Cheatham, Reeser gave him the whole rundown, hometown, weight, etc. And it's dead silent in the crowd when he actually says the name Ron Cheatham, except for one jagoff in the audience that just went, whoa. The one sympathetic Shreveport fan that wanted to break the awkward silence. What a troll. So anyway, it went about 2 minutes, and then Mr. Olympia went over with the sleeper hold. That was his signature move back then. At this point, they're still recognizing him as one half of the Mid-South Tag Team Champions, alongside JYD, who actually wrestled in the next match. He did not have a belt present with him, though. So some tells me we might see DiBiase and Duggan try to plead a case to Mid-South President Charlie Lay. Or Grizzly Smith. Because he was the matchmaker. Maybe they got a bone to pick with him. But again, not much more to say about this one. You know, because of the long opening VTR, they kind of threw out a bunch of quick squashes in a row this week. It was not a very angle-heavy episode, which is another thing that made Mid-South so great back in the day. The way they spliced up the angle and match-heavy shows versus the promo or squash-heavy shows. There was always variety with everything they did. It wasn't all 24/7 crash TV chaos. They always left you wanting to come back to see more. I wish I could say I wanted to see more of the Junkyard Dog versus the one-man gang. But, I'd be lying if I said that were the case. So let's address the pink elephant in the room. The biggest problem with watching these shows on the old network. The fucking dubbed over music. I hate that shit. When I started watching these Mid-South episodes on the network, and I realized they dubbed over Another One Bites the Dust, I was pissed. I was like, you motherfuckers. Now they throw in some stupid generic replacement tune that sounds nothing like Queen. There's no lyrics for one. It's kind of the same tempo as Another One Bites the Dust, but it still sucks. That's going to be so annoying, having to listen to that every single week JYD comes out. Fuck the WWE for not getting the rights to use that song. Anyway, well, this went about as you would expect. General Skandar Ogbar was in the Mid-South Territory during this period. He was sort of doing a variation spin-off of the Devastation Inc. crew, including a name that I will mention in a minute here, and God, did that send me into a feat of rage. So JYD and OMG are doing some big lumbering guy spots for a minute. JYD catches Gang for the thumper, barely gets him like a quarter of an inch off the ground. And this is back when Dog was in good shape. And Akbar hits the ring as JYD goes in for the cover, but he gets yanked over the top rope. At which point, as JYD is wrestling with Akbar and trying to beat him up, who should run down? Not making this up. I had totally forgotten he was in Mid-South during this time. Sure enough, it's fucking Killer Khan. The bane of my existence on these world-class reviews. Him and the Missing Link. And I know the Missing Link shows up in Mid-South not too far from now. I'm already preparing myself for that one. God damn it. When I saw Killer Khan show up here, I spat my coffee all over the computer. I was like, no, please. I can't do this. I am one episode in. And we've already got a Killer Khan sighting. They're aiming to turn me on this show immediately. And this is fantastic. So JYD kills Gang with a thumper. Then he kills Akbar as he tries to hit the ring. Then he kills Khan, ironically enough, by hitting him with the thumper. And then he just turns around and hits OMG with a second thumper before Mr. Olympia runs in and spears Killer Khan. By all accounts, this match should have been a DQ the moment Akbar hit the ring. But, no, instead they let JYD get the pinfall. My notes simply read, JYD Goldbergs his way to victory. Because that's basically what happened. Dog Superman'd everybody in sight while the heels had to lumber around and pretend like they were completely incapable of fighting back at a 3-on-1 advantage. But hey, it's Dog. He was the top babyface in the territory, so you had to give him preferential treatment. It's like the Von Erichs in Dallas. You don't leave those guys broken and battered except for the very special occasions. So this is about idiot-proofed in just about every way imaginable. They somehow made a Killer Khan segment passable. Easy enough, I guess. You don't have him wrestle and you just have him go out there to be a bumbling buffoon, taking bumps for the good guys. Huh. If only World Class would have figured that out, instead of trying to make him one of their top heels after the Freebirds left. So then we had the greatest segment of all time. This whole thing probably went like 2 minutes tops, but I didn't even care how pressed for time I was in the last several days. I went back and rewatched this whole thing at least 3 times. Over and over again, I couldn't stop laughing. So we pitched to a recap from 2 weeks ago on Mid-South Television. The match is Dick Murdoch versus Ted DiBiase, or Ted DiBiase, as Skandar Akbar kept referring to him as. He must have been an avid listener to the music composer Claude Debussy. And it's a pretty standard back-and-forth match, I believe for the North American title, now that I look back. I wrote it down somewhere here. In any case, you can tell these guys are more than halfway through the match because they're totally sucking wind. Murdoch in particular looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He was so blown up. And, well, figuring that Hacksaw Duggan was hanging out on the floor, you probably assumed he was bound to get involved. But here's the spot that I died going back and watching again. They do the Irish whip off the ropes, and DiBiase is supposed to catch Murdoch in a fall-away slam position. And the plan is to do the inadvertent ref bump to Alfred Neely, where Murdoch's boot would clip him in the jaw, and then he was supposed to go down selling. The issue with this execution was that not only was Murdoch so blown up, he could barely get himself like 3 inches off the ground to get in position for this move, but when Murdoch catches Neely in the head with his boot, in order to make Neely not look like a dipshit, he basically has to bump out onto the concrete to avoid not seeing Duggan's blatant interference. So Murdoch clips him. Neely then proceeds to turn around at a complete 360-degree angle. And I am not kidding when I say this. Neely takes an intentional suicide tope bump out to the floor. I was dying when I saw this live. He literally did a tope suicida out to the floor. Like he'd been shot out of a cannon. Like he was Austin Aries going airborne. It was the funniest ref bump I've ever seen. I laughed harder and harder every time I went back to watch it. So ridiculous. But of course they needed to do that so Duggan could interfere while the other officials ran down to attend to Neely's dead body. Also, he could end up counting the pin anyway after Duggan ran in to tackle Murdoch during the attempted brainbuster. I wish I would have clipped that ref bump. Alfred Neely won me over on this show. He is now my second favorite referee, next to Tommy Young. So from there, we pitch back to the ring for Ted DiBiase versus Tim Horner's Porn Stash. Non-title. A very young, perky Tim Horner, if I do say so myself. He was not quite rocking the mullet look yet here in '82. Boy, was he greener than a pepper tree, though. It takes a lot of effort to fuck up a running clothesline spot off the ropes. Horner managed to do it. Don't ask me how. He had some okay-looking head scissor takeover spots, though. But DiBiase ended up going over with a figure four in about 90 seconds. Really nothing much to it. They actually split up DiBiase and Duggan into separate singles matches this week. Because then they came back from break for Hacksaw Duggan versus Mr. Wrestling 2. It's still so weird going back to watch Hacksaw Duggan when he was a top heel. Like, you watch him out there, he doesn't have the goofy 2x4. He doesn't have the cartoony babyface personality. He's not doing the ho thing. He's just grungy, stern, pissed off Jim Duggan. He's great. Super effective heel at the time. It was a really solid match. One of those TV matches where Bob Root does the majority of the commentary and Boyd Pierce just kind of sits there in utter silence. You'll see that as a common thread during his Mid-South reviews. Boyd was a man of few words a lot of the time. But it's all very basic stuff. You know, Wrestling 2 was working over Duggan's hamstring for a while. There was a point where Bob mentioned Duggan's 52-inch chest. At which point I became immediately discouraged, knowing that if I pumped iron at the gym for the rest of my life, I would never come anywhere close to having a 52-inch chest. And it builds to a spot where Wrestling 2 catches Duggan with a knee lift. Duggan takes a bump out to the floor. That is the cue for DiBiase to come down and talk strategy with Duggan. Of course, you knew what that was leading to. But here's where we get a bit of an interesting twist. As Dick Murdoch ends up running down the stairway from the dressing room to chase DiBiase around ringside. And we get the chaotic four-way sequence where Murdoch is trying to pull DiBiase off the ring apron. Meanwhile, Duggan is trying to set up Wrestling 2 for the spear tackle. And 2 ducks, Duggan catches DiBiase as he goes sailing out to the floor. And then 2 catches Duggan with a second knee lift and gets the pin. Major backfire on the heels' part this go-around. Kind of your prototypical chaotic Mid-South main event angle. It will not be the last time we review these kinds of matches. But again, when done in moderation, not every single match is a chaotic finish. It stands out. Every other match on this show is a simple enhancement squash. But then you get Duggan versus Wrestling 2, which was sort of their featured main event match for the week. And when they shot the big angle at the end, the people went nuts. Because they hadn't seen anything like that on the show yet. Take out the VTRs of the previous angles, which I don't think the fans even saw live anyway. It's good stuff. Really good stuff. And then we came back for a series of what they typically call standby matches. There's another wrestling terminology that's long since been done away with. When's the last time you heard somebody throw around the term standby match? Oh, here, we got a handful of them this week. We had Grappler versus Vinny Romeo. I believe the Grappler was Len Denton here in 1982. This was right before I think he went to Memphis and formed a tag team with Tony Anthony. Cornette managed him for a period of time. Very famous tag team during that time. Went through a couple team name variations. But really nothing much to say about this one until the finish. As you saw earlier on, during the opening VTRs, they were running with the who's who of Mr. Wrestling 2 gimmicks. So at the finish, after the Grappler hits a really impressive looking backbreaker shoulder breaker combo, he catches Romeo with a running knee lift for the pin. Same finish as Mr. Wrestling 2. And of course, Bob Roop is immediately calling that into question. And naturally, here comes the real Mr. Wrestling 2. And the Grappler immediately powders. And it's kind of all there was to it. Intense face-off, but no brawling. Just kind of designed to plant the seed of doubt. But I'm sure they'll revisit this talking point later on. Sounds like this Grappler has something to hide. And then for our final standby match, speaking of Tony Anthony, had to figure he was going to pop up here. Sure enough, he wrestled a name that I am not making up here. This is exactly how Reeser Bowden introduced him. Buckley Christopher George Robley III. All in one breath. You think you could simplify that a little? How about BCGR III? Now, of course, Tony Anthony was the dirty white boy, for those that didn't know. He would not take the DWB moniker until later on. It actually took me a minute here to figure out who the job guy was. Colonel Buck Robley, the guy that legitimately looked like the homeless outlaw bum, that was the guy they were spotlighting here. The one in the yellow t-shirt with the giant beer gut. He was the star. Tony Anthony was the job guy. Could have fooled me. I remember virtually nothing about Buck Robley. It is a name that I have seen pop up. But, yeah, another guy that was unfortunately a little before my time. A little. He was way before my time. Who am I kidding? I mean, it's a name that stands out for sure. The look. Questionable. But, yeah, he ended up going over with the handsome Jimmy elbow drop. Just take out the wacky dance setup. And that was the show. 45 minutes in total. Actually, I think the runtime for this one was about 42 minutes. But it is our first leap into the Mid-South pool, with much more promise to come. Very easy show to watch. Simple. Everything makes sense. The formatting is phenomenal. It's one of those things where I watched the show unfold, having not seen anything from the week or the month prior. Everything made sense. I know what's going on with Mr. Wrestling 2's Decoy. I know about the DiBiase Duggan pairing and their ongoing beef with Dick Murdoch and some of the other top babyfaces. You know, it's a show where you're not left asking a billion questions at the end. It doesn't drive you up a wall with all the crash TV angles. It's a breath of fresh air compared to AEW's insanity. It really is. And that's why I know this review series is going to be well worth the investment. Because I can handle 45 minutes of quality classic wrestling over 2 hours of modern bullshit any day of the week. So with that, got one more segment to cover this week. And we are jumping all over the time machine, are we? We've gone from Atlanta in 1987 to Shreveport, Louisiana in 1982. Now we're moving west. We're at the Dallas Sportatorium. Just jumping ahead 2 years. And here's literally the first thing I wrote down about the show this week. The gall these people had to show an encore presentation of the Kerry Von Erich Killer Khan match last week. Yes, that match. They thought that was something worth replaying. From Bill Mercer's own chicken lips, a match that was both exciting and explosive. Lies. I thought encore presentations were supposed to be warranted. Like, something that the people actually wanted to see on replay again. I can count on 2 fingers the amount of people I know who would love to see a Killer Khan match on replay. Just chop both those fingers off and that'll give you your answer. For those that would like to hear my detailed analysis of that match, go listen to last week. Spoiler, it is not an earth-shattering review. The match sucked, and the missing link interfered for the DQ. I believe Khan's entire offense consisted of chops, weak kicks, and loud squeals. So nothing out of the ordinary. And I remind you all again, this is who the Von Erichs were feuding with now that the Freebirds were out of the picture for the time being. They're collectively stuck trying to pull watchable matches out of the missing link and Killer Khan. Now they're giving it the old college try. So moving along with our first official sanction match, Mark Lorenz doing a stellar job right out of the gate with fucking up the ring introductions by announcing the wrong time limit. It is Gentleman Chris Adams versus Wild Bill Irwin, with Gary Hart and Skandar Akbar in the opposing corners. Now, the story from last week was that Adams and Hart had signed a lucrative deal. Hart was going to take on the role as acting manager of Chris Adams, and we're supposed to accept that and not ask questions. And as I watched this match, the glaring bald spot on the back of Gary Hart's head was quite visible, especially under the bright lights. Generally, I would say the match was okay. Got plenty of time, which, I mean, considering they were promoting this a week in advance, I figured it would go a while. More so about establishing the connection between Gary Hart and Chris Adams. Also to further along whatever's going on with the Hart-Akbar feud. And they're out there doing a back-and-forth competitive match. Crowd's so into it, they all start chanting, Go Gary Go, who literally was just standing on the floor, borderline motionless. Apparently the Dallas fans already forgot who was in the ring wrestling. And they end up building to a spot where Adams catches Irwin with a super kick. But as he goes for the pin, Akbar throws his foot on the bottom rope. Of course, Hazard does not see it, so he waves off the call. And while Adams is distracted yelling at Akbar, Irwin catches him with a clubbing blow to the back. And well, I have no idea what the hell happened here at the finish. I tried to watch it back like 3 times to figure out whether or not somebody blew a spot or what entirely was supposed to happen. I'm still not sure. Basically, Irwin gives Adams a pump kick, and he goes for the pin. And from the camera shot, it looked like Adams may have had a hand or a foot in the ropes, but it wasn't abundantly clear on camera. I think maybe Gary Hart was supposed to throw Adams' foot under the bottom rope to try and imitate what Akbar did a few seconds prior, which would basically equate to Gary Hart attempting to cheat to help Adams stay alive. And, well, Rick Hazard unintentionally counts the pinfall at first, but the bell doesn't ring. And then somehow, while Hazard was talking with Hart on the floor, something happened to where Irwin got knocked out, and then Adams just climbed over and pinned him. I wrote down, I don't know what the fuck happened here, but somebody clearly screwed something up. Up to that point, the match was fine. It's still very vague, the whole ongoing working agreement with Adams and Hart. You know, even when they set it up last week, the indication seemed to be that Chris Adams had asked Gary Hart to be his manager for reasons. And I guess Gary accepted because he just needed an excuse to put his managerial license to use, figuring it would involve him in a more on-screen capacity so he could settle his issues with Devastation Inc. I mean, there's something there, but we're in the development stages with whatever's going on here. So, not a whole lot to go on yet. Speaking of plot development, and me wondering where things are going, here's something I completely neglected to remember. Do y'all remember when Baby Doll was in world-class television for a hot minute? As Gino's backup? I had no memory of such thing. But here she was, here in 1984, sporting the biker chick look, which was quite grungy. Now, before we get too into the weeds, let me back up a few steps. So as you know, Stella Mae French has been a thorn in Gino's side for weeks now. We now have documented footage of her attacking him with a 2x4. That was her being responsible for costing Gino his World Heavyweight title match with Ric Flair. I believe he mentioned that in a promo, but we didn't actually see the footage. But he wasn't lying. Plain as day. Stella hopped the guardrail and gave Gino a 2x4 shot to the ass. And Gino took a spill off the top rope and crushed himself, allowing for Flair to get the pin and retain. So, after weeks of Gino getting outsmarted by Stella's antics, now Gino has reached into his back pocket for Plan B. And that Plan B is short for Plan Baby Doll. AKA, not making this up, this is how Mark Lawrence introduced her, Lady Giant. Going by her regular name by this point, Nicole Roberts, which I don't think was a work. I think her name was actually Nicole Roberts at this point. And her TV debut came at the expense of her jumping Stella in the crowd during a sanctioned Gino versus Mike Von Erich match. Somehow Mark was able to determine this as they cut to the crowd, and all we see is an elderly woman being stomped to death by a 30-something-year-old woman in a leather jacket. I had no idea how Mark Lorenz figured out this was Stella Mae French, but indeed it was. And she ended up hitting Mike with a gimmick behind the ref's back. Baby doll, that is, not Stella. And that allowed for Gino to get the pinfall, I believe ending Mike Von Erich's American Heavyweight title reign, which was very much glossed over. A title reign that was so pointless, I don't even think we saw Mike on TV holding the belt one time. Now he has dropped it back to Gino again. This was something that totally went over my head. I had no idea Baby Doll worked in Dallas before she went up to Crockett Promotions. Chances are her run was short-lived, because by next year, she was already debuting as Tully's valet. And everything that followed with her run with the Horseman and Dusty. I don't know what to make of the whole punk rock look. It's definitely not the same gimmick she ran with a year later, I can tell you that much. I guess you could call this the party stage of Nicole's wrestling career. But with her now being a part of the Gino Stella story, I imagine she'll be around for at least through the remainder of the fall. My hope is that they don't let her do promos, because I think I've heard enough of her doing promos on the studio show for TBS to last me a lifetime. From there, we go back to the ring for George Weingroff versus Jake the Snake Roberts. We have seen a handful of Jake Roberts segments in World Class over the summer, but he's also a relatively newcomer to the territory, at least when it comes to debuting as himself. It's amazing when you go back and watch Jake Roberts footage from the territory days. He's definitely battled with his demons over the years, all the personal struggles he's dealt with, addiction, and the cancer scare from several years ago. It's a lot of ups and downs. But man, you go back and watch Jake Roberts when he was coming up through the system, his work. I mean, he definitely had a unique style that was so different from what everybody else was doing at the time. The timing, the facials, just the overall way he carried himself in the ring. He was never somebody that did more than what was necessary. Even if he was capable, he was all about simplicity, all about milking the big moments. Watching him dissect a body limb, watching the way he sold everything. It really is the quintessential definition of a guy that got it. Jake was always smart to the business. He understood the art of what professional wrestling was supposed to be. And that was clear even when you go back and watch some of his real early footage from Georgia Championship Wrestling in '83. Obviously the World Class run, the Mid-South run from '85 and '86. By the time he got to the WWF, he was already a mastermind. Of course, I can never stress enough how amazing that DDT looked. Just the way he executed it, the precision that came with the way he snapped the headlock on and then drove the guy down to the mat. Nobody hit the DDT like Jake Roberts did, man. Now, this is a showcase match for him. They're letting him go out there, rack up some TV wins, put him on a little bit of a winning streak. Eventually, we'll start seeing him heavily involved in a lot of the top programs, which I'm looking forward to. I have fond memories of Jake's run in Mid-South, but seeing him a year prior in Dallas, I'm interested to see how that run compares and contrasts to his Mid-South run. surely it'll be a hell of a lot more enjoyable to watching Killer Khan missing Link squashes. God, anything is more enjoyable than that. Watching grass grow is arguably more enjoyable. God bless Kerry and Kevin this week. They had the misfortune of trying to make some magic happen here. Well, they had 4.5 minutes. They tried. At best, I can best call this match mediocre. I did like Bill Mercer's comments at Kevin here. I believe he said something to the extent of Kevin being as strong as a bull or strong as an ox, something like that. With the personality of the guy next door. To which I asked, is there a universal personality of what the guy next door is? What is that personality? Was that supposed to be a compliment or an insult? I don't think I've ever heard that saying before. I've heard the girl next door, not the guy next door. In any case, the match is chugging along for a while. It's not good. Really nothing to write home about, though. I've seen worse. There was a spot where Khan attempted to hold Kevin up in an over-the-shoulder backbreaker, which basically ended with him almost dumping Kevin right on the back of his head. And they end up doing the four-way breakdown spot, where Kevin catches Akbar with a right hand on the apron, and the distraction allows for Khan to come in the back door while Link had Kerry restrained, and he catches Kerry with a spike and the subsequent pin. And in a very comedic moment on the floor, we see Khan and Link hugging and smiling, realizing that they just defeated the top babyface team. So even those two were smart enough to pick up on how big a deal that was. I mean, match was a total nothing burger, but you can clearly tell with them putting the heels over like that, they were all in with the Devastation Inc. crew. At least as a top heel unit. All right, then. I never understood it. I mean, their matches are the shits for one. Personalities are very cartoony and over the top. But, yeah. Got to give the Von Erich somebody to feud with, right? As a placeholder filler program, it's fine. But these Von Erich Devastation Inc. segments, they're far from captivating. Right now, I'm more intrigued to see what's going on with Gino Hernandez and Lady Giant, along with Chris Adams' association with Gary Hart. Throw in some of the Jake Roberts stuff, too. You know, they're definitely aiming to climb out of the muddy waters right now, and that's good. I talked about it before. There was a large period of time over the summer where the show was just borderline impossible to watch without being bored into a coma. It's taken a while for them to rectify everything, but even with the Freebirds gone for a while, there's a focus on trying to establish some new names and get over some main event level storylines. How they'll all turn out, that's yet to be seen. I wouldn't say this was the most compelling show from beginning to end, but there was some story development, and I'm okay with that. I've seen better, I have seen worse. All right. Well, that about ends that one. Hopefully this format sticks. I enjoyed the show. I had fun this week. I was not ripping strands of hair out or losing sleep at night. So we'll stick the course with this for the while and see where it takes us. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure you tune in for the Monday show, as we'll be diving in with the new Monday format. And any shows that follow, we'll try to factor in the pay-per-view recaps from Monday too, and well, that'll be some modification I need to make over time. But For right now, the Monday show is going to be the SmackDown, Retro, Raw, and NXT reviews. And we'll keep that format pretty steady. So, again, make sure you subscribe, comment, like the show, and make sure you come back and check us out every week. Take care. Peace out.